Okay, you can go ahead and get started now. Welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. This is Nick Sobral with the Science Collaborative, and I'm joined remotely by Megan Brass and Lynn Vaccaro, who are also running some tech support in the background for us today. So thank you to both of them. Thank you for joining us for this month's webinar, which is titled Promoting Resilient Groundwater and Holistic Watershed Management in Alaska's Kenai Lowlands. And a little bit about the reserve system before we get started. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRS, is a national network of unique research reserves as shown on this map. And this is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research, assessment, and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. So this is our first Zoom webinar, Elephant in the Room. All attendees are muted upon entry as usual, and but this time we'll be handling questions via the Zoom's Q&A feature instead. We're going to try something a little bit different today. So using some Zoom functionality, you can upvote questions that you like, which are posed by other attendees, to elevate them for us and the presenters. And we'll still verbalize questions for the presenters who are listening along. And as always, we encourage you to submit your questions as they occur to you throughout the webinar. And lastly, the chat is open to everyone, so please feel free to chat amongst yourselves and with each other using the chat feature. And with that, I will introduce our speakers for today. I'm pleased to welcome back Coowe Walker, who has presented with us a number of times, and we obviously love having her. But anyway, Coowe has worked at the Kachemak Bay Reserve as a watershed ecologist since the reserve was designated in 1999 and has served as the reserve manager for 3 years. She has been leading efforts to understand ecosystem service values of coastal peatlands in the Kachemak Bay area that are important for salmon streams and also represent potentially large stores of carbon. Mark Rains is a professor of geology at the University of South Florida and the chief science officer for the state of Florida. His research is focused on hydrological connectivity from ridges to reefs, especially between hill slopes, wetlands, and headwater streams, the roles that hydrological processes play in governing ecosystem structure and function, and the roles that science plays in informing water-related law, policy, and decision-making. And with that, I will give control over to Coowe so she can control her own slides here.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you. What you are looking at here is a piece of the landscape that we live in that we're going to be talking about today. This is in the Storiski. You can see a big peatland just behind that with some open water pools. Behind that is Cook Inlet, and about 80 miles across the inlet you can see some volcanoes. So big landscape. And before we get too much farther in, I'd like to acknowledge that this is the homelands for the Dena'ina and Suspiaq peoples who have lived here for thousands of years and continue to live here today. And it's because of their good stewardship in the past and present that we have the opportunity to have the well-being and opportunity to protect the landscapes that we're working in. Thank you.
Yeah.
So here's a digital elevation model. As we call this area the Kenai Lowlands, and we were just looking on the ground at one of the watersheds in the middle here. Our area encompasses the watersheds. We work in five different watersheds. There's Cook Inlet looking down, bird's eye view, and it's called the Lowlands because it's between the Kenai Mountains and Cook Inlet, and it's basically low-lying, meandering, groundwater supported streams. If you could forward the next one. Thanks. So I'm just to give you, we're zooming in a little bit more. The reserve is headquartered down here in Homer, Alaska. This is the Spit. This is Kachemak Bay. These are the yellow outlines are showing the major watersheds we work in. And the reason we got started in this work is because this landscape is really well connected still. We don't have a huge amount of human impact on the landscape, but it's not protected. So if you look at this image and you see all those red lines, those are unprotected streams. And if you notice, they're primarily in the upper parts of the watershed. Okay, so we suspected that these small headwater streams had juvenile salmon in them. And in fact, that's true. This is a juvenile steelhead, so one of the salmonid species here. And so started off just to set the stage. Oops, I went too far. Sorry. We started off just spending a bunch of years trying to understand how landscapes supported headwater streams. And what we learned was that alders and peatlands and groundwater are really driving productivity in these headwater streams. And digging in a little bit more to the groundwater piece, we learned that the groundwater is really important, not just in productivity, but also in temperature moderation. So on the left side of your screen, you see a summertime picture with a seep, groundwater seep that's at 4 degrees Celsius, and you can see the main stream is at 14 degrees Celsius. So it's really helping keep the cool temperature in the stream. And then conversely, in the wintertime, that groundwater is still 4 degrees and it's keeping the water from freezing, which is also good for salmon. So now we're going to do a poll. And the question that we would like people to answer is, do you know where your drinking water is coming from? Is it coming from surface water, groundwater, both, or maybe you're not sure? And we're going to leave this open for 30 seconds and then see kind of where our audience is coming from in terms of drinking water. Nick, you'll have to tell me when 30 seconds is up.
Time.
Time.
Let me share the
okay.
results.
All right. So it seems like a lot of people have, well, yeah, pretty good understanding of where their groundwater is coming from. And some people aren't sure, which is really common, I think. So interesting. Okay, so let's go to the next slide now. We're going to really dig into groundwater here in as a pun. What we so we came from that salmon stream perspective, and we started thinking about groundwater more and going, we know groundwater is important to salmon, but we also know that we're using groundwater in a lot, and we have no idea it's not managed in any way in our region. So we have spring boxes, as you see on the left, people tapping into those springs. We have people drilling wells all over the place for both commercial and residential use. And trying to advance here. Sorry, it's a little bit delayed on my end. There we go. So this is where Mark comes in. We developed a project that got funded through the NERRS Science Collaborative to assess groundwater vulnerability, develop tools that people can use to start managing our groundwater in our landscapes. And you can see from this slide why this might be important. We have gravel pits, roads crossing, streams, all kinds of things going on in the landscape, and really no ways to manage the groundwater. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Mark, who's going to share some of the tools that we developed.
All right. Nick, have you given me control here, I think?
I have. Go right ahead.
Looks like it. Okay. So let me step back and sort of unpack some of the things that Coowe started with. When we started working up here, they had done a lot of the formative work on mapping where the juvenile salmon were using the headwater settings. We sort of came in at the end and helped tidy that up while we were looking around at the groundwater. Though, like right away, I found that this was the leakiest dang landscape I've ever worked in. Like you like almost can't throw a pencil without it landing in a seep or a spring. Just everywhere you look, there's water coming out of the ground, often in close proximity to the salmon streams. And so it was sort of at that time that we were thinking more broadly about how landscape might support salmon. So here's a cartoon of a headwater setting. There's a stream running down the middle. There's some alder patches, or sort of the green sort of up on the hill slope, and then there's some wetlands directly adjacent to the stream. And so we started thinking about how maybe groundwater, which we've exemplified by these sort of dotted flow paths, might be moving across this landscape and might be interacting with those alder patches in ways that I'll discuss in a moment, and then interacting with these riparian wetlands. And all of that sort of would create the hot moments and hot spots that are so important to sort of supporting salmonids, especially juvenile salmonids, and particularly the ones that are trying to overwinter in these settings. And so 15 years of work can probably be boiled down to this one figure. And I want to go through it in some detail because then I'm going to talk only exclusively about our more recent work. So you're looking at a cartoon cross section of a hill slope on the left, and that's a small headwater stream on the right. And there's some juvenile salmonids hanging out on the bank. You can see that moving down that hill slope just below the surface is a line of arrows, and it says water flow. So that's the groundwater moving across this landscape from the hill slope down into those streamside wetlands and then ultimately into the stream. It passes beneath those alders, it interacts with them. Now, alder, if you're unaware, have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that live in their roots. Those bacteria are able to fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere and make it bioavailable to the alder. In exchange, the bacterial symbionts get sugar. Well, that nitrogen, once it's uptaken and then dropped as organic matter, can be remineralized and broadly available to the landscape. So the groundwater that flows out from underneath those alder patches is enriched in nitrogen. That water then moves down and interacts with these streamside wetlands, which might be these big groundwater fed fens or just a sort of a narrow strip of blue joint grass just along the stream bank, or both. The nitrogen there is uptaken by those plants, and that fuels the primary productivity. And so there's this infusion of above ground biomass. Now, some of that water continues to pass through, ends up in the stream, and there it supports maybe half of the stream flow annually. It moderates the temperatures, as Coowe said, and it also brings in some of those nutrients directly. In addition, that sort of enhanced above ground biomass in those streamside wetlands deposits in the stream, where then it becomes the base of the food chain. The beneficiaries of all this are the fish, right? So the fish are really keyed into this sort of landscape scale function, and tying it all together is that groundwater flow. Of course, I'm a groundwater guy, so I naturally would think it's the most important player, but it's really important, right? It's this conveyor belt that's bringing in, mass, energy, and keeping the sort of chemical, physical, and biological structure and function of that stream humming right along. And so if we lose that groundwater, the conveyor belt stops. And so we got real interested in understanding sort of the nature of that groundwater and where it's coming from, and what sorts of impacts might there be to it from climate change or otherwise. So after quite a bit of poking around, there's two types, and I'll white out one and focus on this one first, and then I'll do it for the other. So there is sort of what I'll call hill slope groundwater, and that's sort of annual rainfall, annual snow melt, infiltrating into the shallow subsurface and moving laterally in the shallow subsurface, maybe discharging from seeps in little topographic breaks along the hill slope, maybe discharging directly to the streams. And the time scale of that is maybe days to years. All right, then by time scale, I mean from the moment it infiltrates to the moment it ends up in the stream. A little more complicated is this on the right. And on the right, we have sort of deeper groundwater recharge. In this case, there's a high terrace. It's got a muskeg on it, a big wetland, and there's infiltration through that. And it's moving down through these sandstones, these fractured sandstones, and it's getting into these old channel deposits. These are old sort of glacial outwash channels that are embedded in a tiered structure down below. And they might be sand and gravel, sand and coal in some cases, but they're lower or higher permeability. So water that's infiltrating sort of down through the sandstone formations gets into these and begins to move rapidly laterally. Now, this was all laid down as sort of a big outwash plain at the end of the last glaciation. And Holocene streams have eaten down into that and dug the modern day valleys. Well, it's done that, it's exposed these old aquifers, or these old channel deposits that are now the aquifers. And where those are exposed, there's seeps and springs that burst forth. And there our interest in this is that we could do all sorts of things that might affect these groundwater resources. Anything from building a road which intercepts flow in the shallow subsurface to, as Coowe pointed out, digging wells, which almost everybody's drinking groundwater on the Kenai Peninsula lowlands, and they're drinking from these exact aquifers. Okay, so we became real interested in where this was occurring, right? I'd like to know if now we've decided groundwater is important, it's a limited resource, and we're competing over it. The humans and the fish, and we want to maybe think about how we might balance it. It begins with knowing where it's happening, right? So this is our domain. It's 1,655 square kilometers. That's a lot of territory, and there's not that many roads in it. So it would be rather difficult for us to wander around this landscape and find the springs individually. So we hypothesized that we could find them remotely. We could use geospatial data of topography and geology and predict where groundwater discharge is coming forth and getting into the streams. And so I'm just going to fly through this real quickly to show you some of the data and data products we have. And I'll come back and talk about some specifically and some finer grained examples, but a digital elevation model. So you've got, in this case, it's contours. We've used flow accumulation modeling to model where we think some of the finer grained streams are that are much below normal mapping accuracy. So that's what those blue lines are. Something called the flow weighted slope, which I'll come back to in a moment, that we had previously studied and learned is very indicative of shallow groundwater flow on those hill slopes. Red meaning there ought to be a lot of it, and yellow being not so much. Another topographic data product called topographic wetness index, which has to do with the concentration of flow. So purple is place you'd expect water to be concentrating, light blue not so much. But really importantly, we had about 800 wells that everybody gets to drill a well. Like almost everybody's on groundwater, and everybody's got a right to drill a well and pump away. They don't have to tell anybody. Nobody needs to be the wiser. If you want state level protection, you have to file for a permit with the state. That includes filing what's called a well log. A well log is the driller, as he or she drills down, marks all the formations on a sheet of paper, and then that tells them, where the confining units are, where the water-bearing formations are, how deep the well is, and whatnot. And that has to be filed with the state. And that is made freely available to the public. So for 800 sites in the population centers, we had these well logs. And from these well logs, we could map where the aquifers are located, the depths and thicknesses. We could do some cross correlation to correlate them between different wells. And then we could project them outward and look for places where we might expect them to intersect those hill slopes. Remember the Holocene rivers eating down through these deposits, where we would expect those outcrops to occur. And then that's what these dark blue polygons are, places where we think there are prominent outcrops of these aquifers. Now, no, most of the watershed doesn't have wells. Doesn't mean there's no outcrops out there. It just doesn't have wells, so we couldn't find them. And I'll come back and explain how we got around that problem here in a moment. But that gives you an idea of sort of the scope and scale of some of the geospatial data we had. And so let's go back to our two types of groundwater and think about them one by one. How might we use this information to infer where groundwater discharge is occurring? And I'll start with that hill slope groundwater. So here's a place in the North Fork of the Anchor River. Give you an idea of scale. That wiggly line is about a 1.5 lane dirt road. And the stream is sort of running down through the middle of it. Right. So we would look at this landscape, and the first thing we would do in looking for that shallow hill slope groundwater is turn on the flow weighted slope. Now, flow weighted slope, red means high and yellow means low, just so you get an idea. But what it's really telling us is you get a high value if you have sort of a bowl shape or concave landscape that's concentrating water into a certain location, and if it's steep. So water is being concentrated and that steep slope is driving it. And yellow would be the opposite. You might have a concave surface or a flat surface. So those red and darker orange areas have high flow weighted slope, places we might expect there to be that shallow groundwater flow. And if we turn on the streamlines that we've modeled, note that most of them emanate from those red or dark orange polygons. So these are places where we would expect there to be water coming forth as surface water. And so we go, okay, well, let's drop a point, right? And we do this. This is a real point. I dropped it in the Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve headquarters, and then we went out and looked, and we would do this over and over and over again. And when we do this exercise, high flow weighted slope, start reach in one of these streams, we'd walk right up onto a hill slope covered in seeps. Right. And so that's what I'm pointing at. You can see the sort of the water coming forth from the ground, and that characteristic iron flock is the reduced water, which has reduced iron, which is soluble and therefore mobile, bursts forth and literally rusts. It contacts the atmosphere, it oxidizes, and oxidized iron or iron oxides are insoluble. They come out of solution. And so that orange is super indicative of groundwater discharge. All right, those are pretty easy. We can find those all day long. What was more complicated was figuring out how to find these. Those aquifer outcrops were a little bit more difficult to find. So let's go to another place and I'll show you how we solve that problem. Again, this is now the South Fork Anchor River. And again, for scale, those beige or brown lines are small dirt roads, 1 to 1.5 lane dirt roads. And in the middle of your photograph, you see some buildings. There's including one that's sort of a rectangular white building. That's a high tunnel, which for all of us, we would call it a greenhouse. It gives you a scale of what we're talking about. Right. And at the bottom, flowing in this case from right to left, is what's called Twitter Creek, and it's a headwater of the South Fork Anchor River. So we look at this and we turn on the contour intervals. And I don't know, can you see my you good? Okay, I saw you nod. Okay, so here's our contours. Well, these are pretty obviously streams, right? I mean, we look at those and go, yeah, those are really well-developed stream features. I'm not only interested in those. I'm interested in these right here. Like, look, those are look kind of an incipient drainage. You can see some up here too. Some of these smaller sort of incipient drainages that are kind of interesting. If we turn on our flow lines, see how one emanates from right here, right where that incipient drainage begins. So now I'm getting super interested as I'm sitting back at the headquarters looking at this one. And I'll turn on I'm going to leave my cursor there. I'm going to turn on the topographic wetness index and see how above it, there's sort of this diffuse purple, and below it, there's sort of a more focused purple. Again, right there, there's this place where something's happening, some concentration of flow that's super interesting. And if I turn on the aquifer outcrop layer, it's right there. Okay, so I think from my modeling, an aquifer outcrops there, and I see all this evidence, topographic evidence that tells me something interesting is happening there. So I say, well, let's go to this spot. And we walk up onto it, and it's a spring box. We're literally standing at the spring box. That was sort of funny because I told the owner that I just spent $150,000 finding a spring box she'd developed 20 years earlier. But finding spring boxes wasn't our problem. Our problem, remember, is finding springs over 1,655 square kilometers, most of which is unroaded. Right. So that's the problem. Now, our whole team is really good at finding seeps and springs. Like, we can go through that physical exercise with the database, and we have an overall accuracy of about 95%. In other words, if we say there's a seep or a spring, 95% of the time we go out in the field, we find a seep or spring. Opposite is also true. If we say there's not, 95% of the time we go out there and there's not. Like, we're really, really, really good at it. But I don't really want to spend the next couple of years of my life doing it manually. That would take a long time. It'd be pretty tedious work. So instead, what we did was we taught a computer how to do it. Okay, so that top part, the GIS on the left and the field work on the right, is what I just took you through. So using the field work and the GIS and moving back and forth between the two to train ourselves, like, what do we see and how can we teach a computer to see those same things? So following the GIS down, there's topographic data and data products, and there's geologic data and data products. But remember, the geologic data and data products are not uniformly distributed. Like, they're not everywhere. I've only got them where there's people, and there's only people in a couple places. So instead, we use that information to teach us how to read the topographic data and data products. What are we seeing in the topographic data and data products that are indicative of those aquifer outcrops? And then from the topographic data and data products, we model and we use the field work to sort of cross-validate our modeling. All right, so doing all that, this is what we get. Okay, so this is that same 1,655 square kilometers, the 5 watersheds. Yellow means there's probably not a seep or a spring. The dark blue means there probably is. And we're about 95% accurate with this as well, right? So whatever we learned in our brains, somehow we taught a computer to do. And now we've got a resource that we can all use to sort of inform conversations about how groundwater is moving around this landscape and interacting with the streams. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Coowe, and she can tell us more about what we do with that.
Sorry, forgot to unmute myself. Yeah, thanks, Mark. So the work that Mark has helped us with is huge. I mean, we started from nothing, and now we have this really robust foundation to build from. And all along the way with this project, we've been working with people who work and live in the landscape and do various things in the landscape. We have a growing population in what I like to call a very low regulatory environment, and a lot of land that's and waters that are potentially developable. So we have a lot of people moving here. When people move here, of course, they need water and they need gravel to build things and all this. And so we've been working with a lot of different end users. And I'm just going to go through here and kind of describe some of the ways that we worked with people throughout this project and ways that it's really lifted us up and into the future for things that are happening now and continuing to happen around understanding and managing groundwater. So one of the things we did is work with people, land use planners and managers who manage the city's water supply. There is a public water supply for people who live in the city of Homer, which is a considerable number of people. As Mark and I have said, most people in the outlying areas rely on wells, but there is a city water supply called the Bridge Creek Reservoir. And when we started this project, they didn't understand that there was any groundwater influence to their reservoir. Actually, they thought it was all supported through surface flow through these streams. And they were taking measures. They recognized that they should probably protect these streams in order to make sure that their water supply was maintained. But with this project, what they learned is that this groundwater is actually like close to a third of the water supply in this reservoir. So not only do they need to be thinking, and that's these white lines here are groundwater surface or subsurface flows. And so this has really helped them understand that they need to be managing for groundwater as well. And we actually currently have conversations with the Public Works Department at the city on a regular basis, and we're planning on doing some modeling and management tool development for them in the future. That all started with this basic understanding that groundwater is important and it's limited. So one of the most effective ways we found to engage with people is to bring them in the field. This slide showing the Kachemak Heritage Land Trust, who was one of our key partners, and they allow us to use several of their sites. This one is one where we can take groups of people, and it's a really powerful way to engage with people, talk about the landscape. Mark does a great job of kind of painting the big picture of how the landscape was formed, and then we can talk about groundwater and salmon. There's a salmon stream in the distance here. But to do this requires a lot of work when you get a big group. If it's just a few people, it's fine. But if you have a big group, it takes a lot of work. And our education and training team came up with these site profiles, which are just fabulous tools that basically provide overviews of the logistics of getting to a site, navigating around the site in terms, for people with different mobilities, making sure the site isn't impacted when you have 30 or 40 people, and key messages that you can communicate at a site. So these are tools that we developed through the project that we continue to use and really not only help protect the site, but really reduce the load on our staff. So if we want to take a group out, we can just be like, sure, we can do that. We understand everything about, the logistics and the key messages, and we can even do it without Mark there now because we understand the key messages. So that's another tool that we developed. And this is an image showing a group out in the middle of one of these peatlands with these open water areas in the background. We learned that groundwater is really important for sustaining peatlands. And peatlands are really important, not only to salmon streams, but also to storing carbon. And we're working with citizen science groups and the Land Trust and others to develop a peatland carbon project for our region, which would provide an alternative economic stream for people who are managing and owning these peatlands. So the groundwater piece of this is really important. And this model that Mark and crew developed has been really instrumental in helping us lift this up. So this is just showing you that peat. There in the foreground here, this is a core that we stuck into the ground and we pulled this peat out, and you can see maybe it's glistening here. It's wet stuff. And it's, so one of the things this groundwater model is enabling us to do is to understand how climate change or other land use changes might affect this peat as we develop a peatland carbon project. Another thing that we did a lot with through this project is engaging with indigenous peoples in remote villages, which, as Mark said, it's a vast landscape. There's not many roads. It can be hard to get around, and it takes time to build trusted relationships and in order to have effective, meaningful conversations. And so what we did through this project, we came up with an innovative way of working that has proven to be really helpful, and we're continuing today. And that is to engage with, there's a program that works with remote schools. It's called Project Grad, which stands for Graduation Really Achieves Dreams. And this is a part of the school district. These liaisons basically from Project Grad work with remote villages. They fly into these villages and they have been working with families and the schools there for years. And so those communities know folks. And that, by engaging with them, it gave us kind of a trusted person to work with. And that gave us, by extension, the trust and the ability to engage. And so one of the villages we work with is the village of Tyonek, which is across the land there. And this, what we did is we engaged with we developed a high school internship program, and it's a very small school. So we had 3 high school students. This is Rika, she's one of them. And we flew the students, the 3 or 4 students, high school students, to us, and they spent a few days with us learning about landscape support, all the things we've talked about, landscape support for salmon, which their communities depend on. And they got to catch baby salmon with us. You can see Rika's very happy about this photarium she's holding, which has some baby coho salmon or silver salmon in it. And then we flew to their villages, and they developed videos about groundwater in their village and how they used groundwater and how they understood groundwater and what they learned. Our staff was able to spend a couple of trips there. When they go there, there's no place to stay. Like, you sleep in the school and you're there until you leave. So they would wake up and have pancake breakfasts with the community and do other school programs. It evolved into a really long-lasting relationship. We're still working with these communities, and it's also brought us in contact with other remote villages that we've developed new projects with. So that was a really successful way of working. We also, as Mark mentioned, agriculture is growing here. Mark showed you what we call high tunnels. You're inside a high tunnel here. High tunnels, we actually have the highest concentration of high tunnels in the US, apparently, here on the Kenai Lowlands. And it's really extended the growing season for folks. Really, local food supplies are important because it takes a lot to transport food here. So it's been really great to have this growing agriculture, but it also means groundwater is coming out, is being used to support this agriculture. So we've been working with our local agricultural communities. These are some carrots grown in that village of Tyonek. Look at these monster carrots. This is community high tunnel that provides food for the whole village. And this project really lifted up this understanding to the point where now we're working with the soil and water districts and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, soils folks who work with farmers, and we're doing specific trainings for them on how to use these tools so that they can then inform farmers and make better decisions about where they put their high tunnels or how deep to tap into the groundwater. And we've also done programs with our closer in schools, our local schools, especially the middle school. We found that middle school, so that's the 12 to 13, 14-year-olds, there's not very many environmental programs for middle schools, for at least in our region. And so we worked with the principal. She's great to work with, and we brought all the 100 kids in our middle schools, that's the 7th and 8th grade, out to the Anchor River, and we had them collect data, groundwater data, and then develop their own. They got into teams and each developed a project, and then they reported out to our community council at the end of the year. So it was a really fun, engaging way for the students to learn and also communicate with their community and their parents, of course, too. This was the wettest, windiest day. You can imagine these kids were out there, but they were still engaged. It was awesome. And fishermen, I think you've probably gathered by now that fishing, salmon are super important in our community. Fishermen are really important decision makers. Most fishermen have not seen baby salmon, and they did not understand that juvenile salmon relied on the landscape and these tiny headwaters for their rearing. So we did Fish Need Land 2 field trips in collaboration with the Kachemak Heritage Land Trust, who organized the trips and then brought us out as expertise in the field. This person smiling here in the middle is the president of the North Pacific Fishermen's Association, Malcolm Milne, and you can see how delighted he is to be holding a tank of juvenile coho. These field trips were super successful, resulted in fishing groups voluntarily, wanting to buy land to protect juvenile salmon. So really successful, and we've been continuing to do those. When COVID came, we couldn't we couldn't take people out in the field. We weren't allowed to do that anymore. So we developed virtual field trips, and you can see up here, this is one of the Kachemak Heritage Land Trust employees, Courtney, holding some vials of groundwater. So we went out in the field, collected groundwater, and you can see the different coloring reflecting that iron that Mark was talking about. And then we shipped them to people. We shipped them groundwater, and we shipped them alders, and we shipped pieces of alder, and we shipped them pieces of peat. And then we did live webinars with them where they would open up these mystery samples, and we'd talk about how they supported salmon streams and the importance of groundwater in these systems. So this allowed us to reach some new audiences, which has been really interesting, and has really led to some new relationships and new interest, and broadening that reach of the models that Mark and crew have developed. And so this is kind of a nice summary, kind of, where are we at now? So we developed these models. We have a graduate research fellow through the Research Reserve Fellowship Program, Margaret A. Davidson Fellowship Program. He's one of Mark's students. His name is Edgar. And he's helping us develop vulnerability assessments. So taking that model and taking it another step and saying, like, where are we most vulnerable? And how can we work with people to make decisions around these most vulnerable places? The models and the vulnerability assessments, and working hand in hand throughout the life of this project, and developing these communication tools, the site profiles, all these cross sections and drawings that Mark and I have been sharing. These were all developed through the project, and they're super important communication tools. So we take them when we have these groups in the field. We can have these, we can either hand them out as packages, or we can have a laminated one that we're showing. Really helps people wrap their head around what are complex ideas and things, especially when they're not something that people are trained at understanding. So these have been really important communication tools. And where we're heading now is towards policies and practices that really balance people's needs and salmon needs. And ultimately, we're all connected, and we depend on salmon. And so it's in our best interest to do what's right for salmon as well. And so this tool has been just really, really important for our region. It's hard to think about going back in time and realizing that we didn't know this, because the decisions that are being made every day about where to drill wells, where to mine gravel, where to put your roads or your houses. I mean, doing all this in the vacuum of understanding is where we were, and now we are in a place where we have this. We're still growing it and developing policies around it, but we have it. At least it's huge. So I'm really grateful to the collaboration with Mark and with all of our end users who kind of helped us along the way understand what we needed to do to help them communicate, these important ideas with them so that they had tools that were useful. And with that, I think we're ready to take questions. Are you ready, Mark? Okay. Do we have questions?
Let's find out. I'm trying not to move anything because apparently it messes with your ability to advance your slides. So let's take a look. Looks like Megan's been chatting some resources to people. So thank you for that, Megan. How about I just stop screen share? Well, I guess I can leave this up. This is probably helpful, but yeah, so just a quick reminder of how we're doing Q&A. Just go ahead and type Q&A questions into the console. You can upvote questions that you like to make them kind of more elevated for us to see them. And just a reminder that if we are still getting questions and we run out of time, that any unanswered questions will be passed to the presenters and will be added to our summary resource that gets posted within the next couple days after the webinar. So don't be shy.
I see a question from Kevin. I'll read it and then I'll answer it. So that he says, the seep predictions appeared to rely primarily on topography with an unexplained connection to geology. Given the importance of the buried high permeability channels, what impact does the heterogeneity and permeability and potentially unknown spatial distribution of those channels affect the predictions of seep likelihood? Or is this all considered the buried channels are relatively well mapped? The answer is somewhere in between, Kevin. So they're really well mapped in some locations and at least directly unmapped in others, but we have indirect knowledge of where they are. And I blew past it pretty quickly, but what we did was we used the geologic information to find springs. So like we were going through that second example many times over and finding spring after spring after spring after spring. We became very good at finding them using that aquifer outcrop layer. What we did then was we used that understanding to go back to the topographic data, which is the data that we had everywhere throughout the entire 5 watershed domain. And we learned what we could see from the topography that could help us infer that there was an outcrop. So for example, a real obvious one, you'd see these sort of abrupt stream valleys, these sort of like I was showing you, there's sort of, just a generic topography, and then there'd suddenly be these incipient channels, and you might see them appearing at the same elevation and parallel to one another across the hill slope. And then you might turn around and go across the valley and you'd see them appearing at that same elevation over there. So now you've got sort of this evidence that there's some reason that these stream heads begin at the same elevation on both sides of the valley. And that would tell us, hey, I bet you there's an aquifer outcrop there. We go out there now in a place where we had no well logs and we had no subsurface geologic information, and sure enough, we'd find springs at each one of those locations. We'd find, the outcrops themselves, and so we use that geologic information in some places to teach us how to see the geology from the topography in others. Then we taught the computer how just to use the topography itself. So that's how that ended up getting used. It's a good question, though. It was a little bit, I blew past it pretty quickly, but it was actually about a year of my life. So I covered it in about 30 seconds in this talk. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for just diving in with the questions. That's we're new at this Q&A feature for Zoom too, so that we honestly, if you want to just jump right in when you see questions, then by all means. All right. I know Lynn and Mega had a question, and maybe I'll ask that one to you since answer all the questions. What was the biggest surprise for you in this work? And I don't know if Coowe, you want to answer first, and then Mark, switch the voices up a little bit.
Sure. So the biggest surprise for me was the understanding that we are potentially competing for groundwater with salmon. So so that that the groundwater is much more limited than I think as a resident of the area, I felt like it was, because we all just punch our wells in and draw the water out. And, we generally don't have a problem with, having enough water in that way. But, with this project, as just on a personal level, I started realizing, like, wow, this is really potentially concerning, especially because we have so many more people moving into the region and we have no management tool. I mean, we have no way of managing this. We have roads being developed, like I mentioned, all the time. We have groundwater being pulled out for our growing agriculture, which we're all excited about. Yay, fresh veggies close to home. But we're using groundwater for that. And as somebody who studied juvenile salmon for many years, I had a pretty good understanding of the importance of groundwater to salmon. That was a big focus for me, but I didn't really understand that we might be competing with these salmon. So we were working at protecting, or helping people protect the elements that were connecting the salmon streams directly, groundwater, those alder patches, those kinds of things. What this project did is really help us understand where groundwater is potentially recharging the much bigger landscape scale, and kind of help us point to that really important element of stewardship, because if we don't protect the recharge, obviously we won't have the discharge.
Yeah, and I think what was most surprising to me was how knowledgeable people are about their groundwater resources already, and how receptive they were to having this conversation. And I'll give you an example. And then how well tied in it was to what we were making observation. I mean, like the whole, like it came full circle. So we rolled into one property owner's house, and they said, oh yeah, well, we moved here in the spring and we drilled our well down to 35 feet and we got a little bit of water, it was doing okay. But then by the end of summer, it went dry. We had to truck in water that winter. And so the next spring we drilled down to 175 feet and we got water, and that's the water we use today. And I said, oh, okay, so do you know of any seeps or springs on your property? And they said, yeah, there's one just down the hill over here and another one way down the hill, sort of this other direction. And so we walked down the hill 35 feet lower than their house, exactly the elevation or the depth of their first well, and found a wimpy little seep. This is sort of mid-July and it was already petering out and drying out. And then we walked further down the hill 175 feet below their house, and out came this gushing spring, and that was one of these big aquifer outcrops. And so not only are people super knowledgeable, but it was tied into what we were seeing as well. And of course we did the water quality sampling too, that the water out of their well was exactly the water coming out of the spring. And so it was really interesting to work in a place, and always has been, where people are so connected to their landscape. I mean, like I live in Tampa. This is Alaska in the background here, but it's virtual Alaska. Behind me are 2.5 million people, most of whom would have typed, I don't know, to that question. And we're just not as well connected to the landscape in most parts of the country. And there people are super tied into it. They know where their seeps are. They know where their springs are. They know how deep their wells are. And when I tell them they're correlated, they go, well, yeah, that makes sense. Like they just have this inherent understanding of their landscape. And it made sort of developing this knowledge a lot more fun to me, because it wasn't just me and my team working with Coowe and her team. It was all of us working together. I mean, the entire community sort of jumped in and participated often in one way or another. So I think that was the most surprising thing to me.
Both excellent responses. I learned a lot just listening to this, for what it's worth, if that matters.
Sure.
Another question. As far as next steps go, what are you most excited about? What do you see as the next steps?
You want to take turns again, Mark?
Sure, I'll start. So what we're working on, I think Edgar is on the webinar today too. So Edgar Garon's a PhD student of ours, and the Margaret A. Davidson Fellow for a 2-year period. And he's working on I think Coowe alluded to this, sort of the vulnerability aspect. I mean, it's one thing for us to say, hey, look, I found where all the seeps and springs are likely to be located. It's another thing altogether to say, yeah, but which ones of those are actually at risk? You know, where are there sort of a high density, say, of owned lands that are developed, that are likely have wells that are pulling from aquifers, that are likely outcropping on that hill slope, that are feeding into a nearby stream that we know have salmonids in them. So you know, and we might think about that differently than, you know, springs that are located where there are no homes, or homes located where there are no springs and whatnot. So I think that's really the next bit. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh man, you can't throw a pencil without it landing in a seep or a spring, but you can't manage a landscape that way, right? You can't just say, don't do anything because there's a seep or a spring, because not all seeps and springs are created equally relative to the potential threats from land use, land cover change, and groundwater development and whatnot. So that's the next step from a science perspective, is sort of developing a more nuanced understanding of the key pressure points where we might see that conflict come into play between the human and natural users. So that's what we're working on now, and will be for some time. Coowe?
Yeah, and we're picking up the the engagement piece of things. So people are really jazzed about having this new database. People want to be more trained. They want to understand its capabilities, its limits. And one of the biggest challenges we have here that we've alluded to is that we have a large landscape. There's a lot of different folks who own property and manage property. And so coming up with ways that we can equitably manage, protect, steward the landscape. We all rely on groundwater and on salmon. So we, we have to figure that out. And that's something that we're, our next steps are, how do we figure that out? How can we, like I said, equitably steward the landscape in a way that people and salmon are all maintaining their well-being? And that's a big challenge because we haven't done it that way before. So it's new. It's a new world, and the way it's mostly been done up. I should say it's since Western people have come here, it hasn't been done that way. So Western people carve the landscape up into parcels. Those parcels are owned, and people do what they want on their parcels. And we don't have regulations, really. I say low regulatory environment. That really means next to none. And so building that understanding of connectivity is a huge lift. And this tool is a huge platform to start that lift from. And people want to do it, but it's going to, it's a lot of work. It's a long way to get there, to actually get down to like, okay, but you shouldn't do this on your landscape. But how do we, if we as a community say, let's not, that we really should protect this area, how do we do that in a equitable, like in a way that is fair for everyone? And that's something that we really need to work on. And I think people want to work on, and it's just going to be, a focus of efforts for the next few years.
I think that's a very good point to raise. We are almost out of time, just a few minutes left in the session. I want to encourage people not to be shy and just keep questions coming if you have them. And as a reminder, you can also, if something occurs to you after the session, you can just drop it into the exit survey that will launch after the end of this. And it'll also get a reminder email about tomorrow around the same time. I have one more question here. What tips might you offer to another region or group just starting the process of understanding their own groundwater resources?
You want to start, Coowe?
Sure. I would say, the starting point, at least for us, is just understanding who's using groundwater. So understanding your stakeholder landscape. So for us, that's agricultural users, people who own the land, large parts of the landscape. So indigenous in our region, indigenous communities who own big expanses of the landscape. Municipal water supply. So just trying to understand who's involved and getting them involved from the very beginning. This is something that the Science Collaborative program really encourages, and it was a relatively new-ish way of working for us, but we are completely, we are completely bought over by it now. We pretty much do everything now in this kind of collaborative from the ground up, like who might use the information, how can we build it together type of approach. So that would be my recommendation, is figure out what the need is and who would be making the decisions first.
I would say that the first step from a scientific perspective is to just scour for every bit of existing data, because groundwater, because we can't see it. Well, we can when it comes out of the ground, but for the most part, we can't see it. So it's super data, time, and money intensive to study it. You pay $8 to $10 a foot to drill a well. And you can't drill too many on a project before you run out of money. So finding, every bit of data, and there's more than you'd think. I mean, I've done a bunch of work, or lab has done a bunch of work in Nicaragua, for example, and you'd think, well, I must not know anything down there, but the data are there too. and we found tons and tons and tons of data, but you might spend 6 months or a year just scouring and scavenging data resources. That well database, that 800 wells, we had to find it sort of in a roundabout way. It was actually Coowe's team that found out about it and brought to our attention. The well logs were PDFs that weren't geospatially referenced. So we had to create the geospatial reference, and then we had to download the PDF, and then we had to key in all the data manual. I mean, it just took forever. But
that was a huge amount of work.
It was a lot of work, and we're still working on it. I mean, we've spent a couple of years on that database, and Edgar and one of his undergraduates is working on it still today. So, but the data are often there. It's hard to find, and hard to get those data into useful resources. So that would be my first thing, is just spend some time looking for what is already known before you launch off and try to learn something yourself.
And one last tip I would say is find a groundwater expert like Mark to work with, because we wouldn't have known, this, we know the community, we understand, how the community, how we work, we're part of the community, and we understand the needs here, but we didn't have a clue how to go about understanding the groundwater piece of it. And so, finding Mark or someone like Mark who can help you and has that expertise and make sure it's somebody that you like working with, like we really like working with Mark and his team, because it does take time. And I think having that continuity, as Mark mentioned, he's been involved in our salmon stream studies for years, and now, helping us understand the aquifers underneath the land. This has been a long-term relationship, and just going back to that, trusted long-term relationships are super valuable. And so find someone that you like and has the expertise and you can envision working with for a while.
Both very good points. We are out of time. I did see one last question come in, so maybe I will just quickly let you guys do a 10-second speed round and see if you can answer this last question. Worst part of the job and best part of the job.
Oh, my worst part's easy, being in the office. Best part, being outside and working with people.
Yeah, worst part, COVID protocols meant we couldn't travel there last summer, and we had to do an entire summer remotely. Best part, we're lifting them, and we're coming back this year to finish up some stuff that we've left hanging for the last 2 years. It's tough to do work like this sitting in an office in Tampa. Much better to do it with this wonderful collaborative relationship that we have with Coowe and her team and the NERRS system. So we're really looking forward to getting back to that.
Great job answering those questions. And oh, sorry, Coowe, I cut you off there.
Oh, I just said us too.
All right. It's nice to end on a positive note. So with that, I will extend just a big thank you to Coowe and Mark for sitting with us today and giving us a great presentation and answering some questions with us. Be on the lookout for the recording in the next 1 to 2 days. Usually I try to get them posted as fast as possible, so it should be made available in the next day or two. And next month, Our webinar is titled, Can Oyster Aquaculture Help Restore Coastal Water Quality? And this webinar will feature a recently completed research project that addressed critical information gaps identified by water quality managers and regulators. So we hope you can join us, and that is May 25th. And with that, everyone have a great day, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thanks for hosting us, Nick.
Yep.
Anytime.
Great job.